Hello everybody, welcome to week 8. We're over halfway through the course, kind of hard to believe. Okay, so quick announcement: this week we're going to have our midterm. It'll be available on Friday at 7 a.m. until midnight on Saturday. It's closed book. It'll be a combination of multiple choice, true, false, and short essay questions. I've posted on Canvas a short study guide. It's not in depth, but it just provides a list of topics to be familiar with. Key concepts from the reading, things that I've discussed in the video, things we've discussed in the discussion boards themselves, obviously within your discussion board. Those are all fair game. So just make sure you have a look at those things and think about those topics. Okay, so this week we're talking about Machiavelli, right? Oh, also I wanted to say I changed up the material a bit this week. Rather than actually reading the selections from Leviathan and Hobbes, I asked you guys to listen to a couple of podcasts. I think it's good. A couple of students actually suggested mixing up readings with podcasts and movies, and I think it's a really good idea. So for this week, rather than having to painfully pour through Hobbes, Leviathan, you can actually listen to this guy from Yale talk about Hobbes. It's really interesting. So anyway, Machiavelli, right? So we're taking quite a departure from Aristotle when we talk about Machiavelli, and I thought I'd start by reading this paragraph from chapter 10. It's in the first paragraph. Concerning things for which men are, and especially princes, are praised or blamed, to sort of frame our conversation. So here's what Machiavelli says. It being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, understands it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of a matter than the imagination of it. Right. So right there, he's starting to take pot shots. He's talking about reality. He's not talking about some utopian vision of the world, right? For many, read Plato and Aristotle, have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live. Right? So he's saying reality is quite different than the morality, the way that people actually should behave. That he who neglects what is done, the reality, for what ought to be done, the morality, sooner affects his ruin than his preservation, right? So if you don't act with reality, and you're acting in a way that you think things ought to be, it could lead to your ruin. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue, read Aristotle, soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. Right? So he's calling Aristotle out, and he's saying, yeah, it's a great theory. You've got Aristotle, but that's not the world we live in. So let's talk about the way things actually are, right? And unfortunately, we, just as in this course, we can't look at the entirety of the Prince, but these chapters that we looked at do a pretty good job of sort of summarizing, what Machiavelli thinks about the way a prince should rule. Right? So we have to, before we can do that, we have to put ourselves in a bit of context, right? So what kind of world are we living in, or at least that Machiavelli believed that we were living in, right? Well, Machiavelli was living in Florence, in sort of the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and it was a world that was very cutthroat, right? I mean, the principles and laws and justice and international criminal courts and all the stuff that we actually have in place now didn't exist in Machiavelli's time, right? So things were, as Hobbes says, and you'll hear about this week, the state of nature is a state of war, right? Where life is, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, right? That's the world that Machiavelli was living in at the time, right? And Machiavelli had a very realist perspective of international relations, right? So he believed that, he started with the assumption that first there's limited resources in the world, right? And people are going to try to grab those resources. And the strong, the rulers, are the ones who are going to take those resources, right? So once again, we're getting back to Thrasymachus. We're getting back to the Athenians in the Melian debate, right? The strong take what they can. So that's the viewpoint that we're coming from with Machiavelli. Okay, so sort of given that perspective, right, Machiavelli's saying, okay, the world is, we're in a state of war in the world, right, this state of nature. And if this is the case, then as a ruler, you know, what do you need to know and what do you need to do to keep your power and take, you know, what you need for yourself and for your people, right? So he talks about 3 or 4 different things in the readings, right? So the first thing is obviously the art of war, right? Von Clausewitz, another political and military theorist, once said that war is just politics carried out by other means, right? So this relationship between politics and war is fundamental, right? Even if you go back to the ancient sort of Greek roots of different types of states, like democracy, right? Aristocracy, right? That we think of that word, that suffix at the end, krasi, as meaning rule of, right? But what it actually goes back to is the Greek god of war, right? Kratos, right? So that's where the word is actually taken from. So when we're talking about democracy or aristocracy, what we're really talking about, if you go back to the root of the word, is who has the legitimate authority to actually wage war. So in a democracy, the people have the legitimate authority to wage war. In an aristocracy, the few do, right? Or the rich, in Aristotle's case. So yeah, this notion of states as instruments of war is true. It's fundamental. It goes all the way back, right? And you know, it's an interesting question to think about, you know, how our world has changed, if it has changed, since the Middle Ages, right? Since the Renaissance, when Machiavelli was writing, and how that may affect our notions of what, you know, a state actually is, whether it is still the legitimate instrument of war. Anyway, okay, so given that, right, Machiavelli says because the state is an instrument of war, because we're living in a state of war, if you want to get power, right, so it's not just if you want to maintain power. If you want to get power, you need to know how to wage war, right? You know, what are the proper tactics, right? And he talks about not only can an understanding of the art of war actually help a prince rule, but it can turn a common person into a king, right? Caesar. I mean, Caesar, a perfect example. Caesar was a general, right, in the Roman army. And, you know, because he had skill and prowess in the military arts, he was able to, you know, overthrow the Roman Republic and institute himself as dictator, right? So, certainly true, right? And he says all these things, you know, it can do these great things, like it can tell you about your country and the terrain and the lay of the land, and, you know, your people are going to view you as strong, and all that, right? But being a ruler, at least in that times, was about being prepared for war and being prepared to utilize force at any minute, right? So that's the number one thing on Machiavelli's mind when he's talking about what a ruler is. And he even goes so far to say, you know, the art of war is the sole task or the sole art reserved for the ruler. And that makes sense because the ruler is the one who is going to be declaring war and who has been given legitimate authority to do so. So, okay, so he talks about that, and then he moves into this next chapter where he's talking about, you know, things that princes should be praised for and things that princes should be blamed for. And this is where I read you this paragraph, right, where he's talking about, you know, the way the world is versus the way that we think the world ought to be. Right, and he lists off this list of, you know, virtues, which very closely correlate to the virtues that Aristotle talks about. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about it's good to be faithful, it's good to be generous, it's good to be courageous, all these things, right? And he sort of compares them to, you know, to their opposite, courageous versus cowardly, right? Liberal versus mean. Right, all these different sort of this span of virtues and vices that he talks about. And he says, look, you know, this is great, but in reality, there's a couple of problems with this. First, it's impossible for any person, any one person, ruler, to embody all these good characteristics that Aristotle lays out as being, virtuous, right? And then he says, in the case of being a ruler, sometimes it's the case that if you want to actually, rule and wage war and maintain your power and keep your power, you actually need to do bad things, right? So he talks about that in the end. He says, the appearance of doing something good or virtuous can often lead to ruin, whereas the appearance of doing something bad or doing something bad actually can lead you to prosperity, right? So essentially, he's leaving behind sort of the moral dimension of politics, right? And he's saying, you do what you have to do. That was the title of this week's lecture, Whatever It Takes, right? Whatever it takes to maintain power. But of course, he has caveats with that, right? He says you have to be careful. The things that you let people see you do that may be bad, right? Because there are certain things that if people perceive you as being bad, you can be overthrown, right? So even though you have to do bad things, you have to be very careful to cover your tracks, right? And just when I was reading Machiavelli and thinking about this particular lecture, it just kept reminding me of the show House of Cards, right? And if you guys haven't seen the Netflix show House of Cards, watch how Kevin Spacey's character acts throughout throughout the show and how he goes about managing power, right? And you'll find that a lot of the stuff that Machiavelli is saying is precisely what he's doing. Although it is interesting to see that after he actually achieves his final goal and becomes the president, the things that he utilized to actually put him into power don't really serve him too well when he's actually trying to carry out the duties of that office, right? So perhaps there's a difference between the acquisition of power and keeping power versus actually governing or ruling, right? So that's another question to think about. Is there something more to being a statesman, something more to ruling, something more to governing than just maintaining your power, right? So, and that's a problem that Kevin Spacey runs into in this particular show in the last season. So then he moves on to this question of liberality versus meanness. So one thing we have to be careful of is we have to distinguish what he's talking about when he's talking about liberality and meanness. He's not talking about liberal as in the sense of people, modern day liberals being associated with the Democratic Party and things like that, and meanness as being an actual not kind person, right? He's actually talking about the way you spend your money. So liberality is closer to generosity, and meanness would be closer to being frugal or maybe even being stingy, right? So Machiavelli says that people have this desire to be liberal and to give freely, and they want to be perceived by the people as being magnanimous, and they don't want to be perceived as being stingy. But he says this is a problem, right? Because if you're overly liberal, especially with your funds or your subjects' funds, a couple of things happen, right? So if you give too much of your own money, which politicians usually don't do, but if you give too much of your own money, then you're going to become poor, right? And if you're going to become poor, how are you going to maintain your army and the power of your realm, right? Well, the answer to that question is you're going to raise taxes. So you're going to tax your people more, right? And if you're going to tax your people more, people aren't going to like you very much if you're going to raise taxes and take their money to spend, right? So, on the surface it looks great to spend money on all these social programs, but of course the question you run into is where are you going to get the money, right? In our case, we just borrow it from other people. But yeah, so he says that's a problem. So according to, but there's one caveat, Machiavelli says, if you got other people's money, spend it liberally, right? So, let's say you conquer, or you make somebody a colony, take all their money and spend it as liberally as you want. But you have to be very careful about spending your money and your subjects' money. So it's much better to be frugal, right? Because even though people may not like it at the end of the day, they can live with it, right? Because you're still going to be able to maintain the strength of your nation. And, he also says people respect it more. This is the same thing with clemency, which he talks about next. People respect it more if you show a few examples of being liberal. You're perceived as much more generous if you give just on random occasions rather than giving, all the time, right? So Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to say about that? No, I think that's it. Okay, so and then the last chapter is one of the most famous passages from Machiavelli's Prince, where he's talking about, is it better to be loved or feared, right? And then the title of the chapter is On Clemency and Cruelty, right? Is it better to be clement, which means merciful, or is it better to be cruel, right? So his idea, of course, is that ideally you would like to be both, but it's not often the case that both can exist in the same person. So given the choice, the ruler's preference would be to be feared versus to be loved. And he has several reasons for this, but the primary reason is that being feared is something that's actually in the ruler's control, right? He says that human beings are very fickle, and somebody who loves you today might hate you tomorrow, depending on if the circumstances change. So given the choice, you have to do something that is actually within your control, right? You can put certain procedures, safeguards into place to make sure that you're feared. You can act in a certain way to make sure that you're feared, right? But the way that somebody feels about you is not really under your control, right? So it's better to put practices into place to make sure that the people fear you and respect you. Therefore, when things get bad, they're going to know that they don't want to cross you. Rather, is if you come across as everybody loves you, you can put yourself forward as being weak, right? And so yeah, given the choice, fear is better than love. Okay, so that was just sort of a general overview of the reading. But the question that I posed to you guys in the discussion was, is Machiavelli's notion of what it means to be a good statesman, a good prince, right? And it's probably even problematic to compare Aristotle's notion of a statesman with Machiavelli's notion of a prince, but are those two consistent with one another, right? And of course, the answer is no. As a matter of fact, Machiavelli wrote his treatise to almost explicitly contradict Aristotle's notion of what it meant to be a good statesman, because throughout the Middle Ages, and even through sort of the Dark Ages, Aristotle's notion of what it meant to be a good statesman was the authoritative treatise on the particular subject of governance. It had been sort of maintained by the Middle East and the Muslim nations, and it had been passed on back to the West, especially with the Renaissance coming up. So Machiavelli set out to deliberately counteract what Aristotle was saying. And remember that for Aristotle, what it meant to be a good statesman was that you had to be virtuous, right? And it's really tricky when we're dealing with this concept of virtue, because it's very hard for us in our mind to separate virtue from morality or virtue from goodness, right? And remember, for Aristotle, anything has virtue, right? A knife has virtue if it's sharp, right? And an eyeball has virtue if it can see well, right? So virtue for Aristotle was just carrying out the fundamental qualities of a human being, right? So for Aristotle, to be a virtuous human being meant to live in accordance with a life of reason and rational thinking, right? And to be a virtuous statesman meant that you needed to rationally carry out and be aware of all the things that are involved in political science, right? And that's where he's talking about, in what we read about the different constitutions. The virtuous statesman needs to know all the different constitutions, and they need to know which one is appropriate for which one, and if one is failing, when should you put another one in, right? And all that requires an extensive amount of knowledge about political science and about governance. So it's hard to believe that Aristotle had not considered, because there were certainly states very similar to Florence, during Aristotle's time. I mean, Machiavelli talks about this sort of military rule. The Spartans were just down the street, right? I mean, Aristotle was quite aware of this particular way of thinking. And furthermore, one of the people that Machiavelli cites as one of his great examples of being a military leader was Alexander, right? And who was Alexander's tutor? Aristotle, right? Aristotle's the one who taught Alexander. So it's very unlikely that Aristotle was not aware that there are these difficult decisions that have to be made, right? So in addition to being aware of all these different forms of government and how you rule, there was something else that Aristotle thought that a ruler needed to have, and that was practical wisdom or judgment, right? Which kind of gets to the same thing that Machiavelli is saying, where you have to be able to realize when you have to do something bad to achieve a good outcome, right? So for Aristotle, being a virtuous ruler could very well mean that you're using your practical wisdom to determine when you need to make a particular decision, right? Because Aristotle didn't believe that there were hard and fast rules about what was right and what was wrong. Aristotle thought that it depended upon the particular situation. He was a particularist. He wasn't a universalist. So for Aristotle, what the right thing to do when confronted with a situation like, let's say, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for Aristotle, what the virtuous ruler would do in that case is that they would weigh the situation. They would use their judgment to do, what was best given the knowledge that they had, right? So now, granted, there are these certain qualities of morality that Aristotle espouses in the Nicomachean Ethics, and he said that you need to be somewhere in the mean between the two extremes, right? So Aristotle would not argue that you need to be overly religious, right? Or you need to be overly generous or overly liberal. As a matter of fact, liberality was considered a vice to Aristotle. It was the mean, right? So it's the golden mean. So you can certainly understand where Machiavelli was coming from in criticizing those things, but it's not clear to me that Machiavelli had a very nuanced understanding of what Aristotle was actually doing, right? And what Aristotle actually thought about the way somebody should rule, right? And they're also going at two different questions, right? Because Machiavelli is primarily concerned with how does one get power and how does one stay in power. That's not really what Aristotle was asking. Aristotle was saying, okay, once you've gotten power and once you're in power, how do you rule, right? And Machiavelli talks about that some when he's talking about it's better to be feared than loved and things like that. But there's a lot more to being a statesman than there is to being a prince or a despot, right? And that's why Aristotle had a problem with the kind of rule that Machiavelli was espousing, because what do you think is going to happen if you have a prince who has that absolute power, who's achieved absolute power, they have this strong military, they're going to stay in power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So what is the likelihood that Machiavelli's prince is going to turn into a tyrant? And that's precisely why Aristotle thought that kind of government was a perversion, right? It was not one of the ideal forms of government, right? It's not to say that there couldn't be one ruler one ruler system, a monarchy, but that person would have to act in a virtuous manner according to Aristotle's notion of virtue. And it doesn't seem to me that the type of system that Machiavelli lays out is going to lead to that, right? Which is going to likely lead to the collapse of that particular entity. So hence the reason that Aristotle argues for a republic and sort of the rule of law, right? Because precisely as Machiavelli says, right, nobody is all good. Nobody has all good qualities. Therefore, that's why we have the Constitution. That's why we have the rule of law. Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So that's why we put these laws into place, to ensure that we don't devolve into some sort of tyranny. Anyway, Machiavelli's fun, and I wouldn't say that Machiavelli is completely wrong, because he is. Look at politics in Washington. What's going on is very realistic to what Machiavelli is saying. However, I would make the distinction that there's a difference between what it takes to get power and maintain power and what it gets to actually govern. And there you have a distinction between the notions of politics and government. So anyway, that's it for this week. If you guys have any questions about the midterm,